What's going on, college football fans? Jack here with another episode of The Big and Bold. And the purpose of today's episode, really straightforward. I want to get into my prediction for what the final playoff rankings are going to be. Now, if you want to look at the screen, I just have something that's going to help me present the information a little easier if you want to take a look at that. So from 1 to 4, you have the current playoff poll. Georgia at 1, Michigan at 2, Alabama 3, Cincinnati 4. So, the other two teams, you got Oklahoma State and Notre Dame. Those two teams are in contention for the playoff. At the bottom of the screen, I have the conference championship games that we have coming up this weekend. Michigan, Iowa, Oklahoma State, Baylor, Georgia, Alabama, Cincinnati, Houston. So over the course of this little episode, I'm going to move around our logos a little bit, and you can kind of get that screenshot of this is what the playoff could look like, and use that to base your prediction for what the national championship is going to be. But of course, we have our conference championship games that need to be played first. So, the most important one to look at initially is Georgia, Alabama. So first-ranked Georgia taking on third-ranked Alabama. Unique thing about this season is that Georgia and Alabama did not match up against each other this year. So, when they play for the first time this weekend in the SEC championship game, what's either going to happen is Alabama will take down Georgia and assume the number 1 spot, or Georgia's going to take down Alabama and knock them out of playoff contention. Alabama's already a one-loss team. They're sitting at 11-1. If they fall to 11-2, that will most certainly knock them out of the playoff. Georgia's 12-0. So even if they lose, they're not going to fall that far. But let's work on this scenario in a world where Georgia and Alabama, in this situation, if Alabama does win, then of course Alabama's taking the number 1 spot, and in my opinion, Georgia would fall to 2. Michigan has a huge win over Ohio State, but I think that Georgia would get bumped down to that 2nd spot. Now, no matter how you look at it, I think that it would be either Georgia 2, Michigan 3, or Michigan 2, Georgia 3. They're going to be facing off in the first round of the playoffs, as long as Michigan gets past Iowa. Now, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about Michigan, Iowa, because Michigan is such a heavy favorite. Of course, if they lose, they're out of the playoff. But we're going to talk about the ramifications of that in a minute when we get to Oklahoma State, Notre Dame. Now, in this situation, I think that for the other 4 teams in conversation here, Cincinnati, Oklahoma State, Michigan, Notre Dame, they don't want this to happen, because I think that they would much rather Alabama get knocked out of the playoff and not have to face Georgia at number 2, and then somebody, in all likelihood, would have to face Alabama in the national championship game. I don't see Alabama getting knocked off by a 4th seed if they're capable of beating Georgia. So that's how that scenario would go. But that's not how I have it happening. I do see Georgia taking down Alabama. I think that Georgia's defense is too good. Alabama has looked rocky against multiple teams. Florida, Auburn, they went into 4 overtime periods. They have that loss on their record to Texas A&M. I just don't know if I see them being able to take down Georgia. So I do have Georgia taking down Alabama, but that's how that would look. Now, next very impactful game I want to talk about, Oklahoma State, Baylor. Now, what the committee did, and I'm going to throw Cincinnati into this conversation as well, is show that by placing Cincinnati at 4, they value an undefeated Cincinnati over a 1-loss Oklahoma State. So in my mind, if Cincinnati takes down a top 25 Houston team, and Oklahoma State beats a top 25 Baylor team that they already have a win on this season, mind you, Cincinnati would stay in the top 4 and not be topped by Oklahoma State. But if both of those guys win, then they're both in the playoff, unless Alabama beats Georgia. If Alabama beats Georgia, then your top 3 is going to look like Georgia, Michigan, Alabama. And that 4th spot, with what is projected to be an undefeated Cincinnati, I would assume would have to go there. As long as, of course, they beat Houston. Now, let's say Georgia does beat Alabama and they knock them out of the playoff. I assume Michigan beats Iowa. That's going to be a continuous trend here. Of course, they lose, they're out. Michigan's a 1-loss team, but I believe they win that game. I think with Alabama getting knocked out and Cincinnati beating Houston, they would get knocked up to 3. Oklahoma State beats Baylor. they take over at 4, and Oklahoma State is in the playoff. As you can see, we haven't touched Notre Dame yet. Now, the disadvantage Notre Dame has is they don't have a conference championship game, being an independent. So they're sitting at 11-1. They're only lost to Cincinnati earlier in the season. The way for Notre Dame to get into the playoff is a little specific. They can't afford Alabama to beat Georgia because, as I said, that top 3 essentially gets locked up as long as Michigan beats Iowa. And the 4th spot is going to be between Cincinnati and Oklahoma State. The winner of their games takes that 4th spot. Now, there is a path for Notre Dame to make the playoff. I think it starts, and it's more likely that Oklahoma State does not take down Baylor a second time. Also, Alabama loses to Georgia and gets knocked out of the playoff. Additionally, Cincinnati beats Houston. They get bumped up to 3, and I think Notre Dame would slide in at 4. Now, of course, the recent news is that head coach Brian Kelly, former head coach of Notre Dame, is now the head football coach of LSU. So defensive coordinator Marcus Freeman is getting bumped up as the interim as far as I'm tracking for the postseason. I don't think the committee wants Notre Dame. I'll be completely honest. I don't think that they want a head coachless team in the playoff. It's not a good look. And it's a team with one less game played than everybody else because they don't play a championship game at the end of the season. So for those reasons, I know they don't want Notre Dame in. But if Oklahoma State loses, or as a matter of fact, if Oklahoma State wins and Cincinnati loses, as well as Alabama getting knocked out by Georgia, there's a scenario where Notre Dame gets into the playoff at 4 as well. Don't think it's likely, but it is a possible scenario. With that, I can give you the most likely. And I think the clear most likely, and this isn't anything crazy, but if I throw back up the current rankings of 1 through 4, what I think happens here: Georgia knocks out Alabama. Michigan secures the 2nd spot in the country by beating Iowa. Cincinnati takes down a top 25 Houston. They fill in at the 3rd spot. Oklahoma State takes down Baylor in the rematch, and they come in at 4. And then the first round of the playoffs, you're going to have Georgia taking on Oklahoma State and Michigan taking on Cincinnati. This would be, I think, a perfectly fine scenario. I think I would be absolutely fine with this happening. I think Cincinnati and Michigan are an interesting matchup. People will discount Oklahoma State's chances against Georgia, but Georgia's not an unstoppable team. I think looking at these 6 teams, anybody could make it to the national championship. Anybody could win the national championship game because it's Alabama. We saw them do it last year. This team isn't as good as that last year's team, but they're still a fantastic team. You look at Cincinnati. Yes, they are not one of your traditional SEC, Big Ten schools. They've been undefeated in the regular season the last 2 years. Their only loss the last 2 years was a 3-point loss to Georgia in the Sugar Bowl last year. That's an incredible run of games. They're a phenomenal team led by a good head coach in Luke Fickell. Oklahoma State, Mike Gundy has them in a position to make the playoff as long as they beat Baylor again. They've done it before, they can do it again. Any of these teams can make it. If you ask me for what I think is going to happen, I think you're going to have Michigan take down Cincinnati and Georgia take down Oklahoma State, and they're going to meet in the national championship game. Now, interesting stat, last time Michigan was ranked as the number 2 team in the country was in 2016, and they lost to Iowa. Now, maybe it's a good time for Michigan to get some revenge on Iowa for that, but time will tell. Georgia, they'd love to get their teeth into Bama and knock them off, win an SEC title, get to the national championship game. But this year's been absolutely crazy. Anything can happen. This may not be what happens. And in a crazy world, Michigan can get knocked off by Iowa. Georgia goes down to Alabama. Oklahoma State loses their rematch. And you have a playoff where you have a head coachless Notre Dame taking on a group of 5 team in Cincinnati. And you could have a rematch between Alabama and Georgia in the national championship. This is entirely a possible scenario here. I'm not saying it will, I'm saying it could. I don't think I want it to happen, but it could. I like the idea of, realistically 4 different teams making it into the playoff and trying to win a national championship. We haven't seen Michigan make it to the playoff. We haven't seen Cincinnati in the playoff. Notre Dame's made it in, but they haven't made it to a national championship. We haven't seen Georgia win a national championship since like the 80s. There's a lot of parity going on this season, and I love it. I love that it's anybody's national championship, essentially, to win. And that's why we love college football, is because it's a crazy sport and anything can happen. But hope you guys like this video. Thanks for watching. I just wanted to use this to try and help better articulate the information to you guys. And, of these scenarios, which one is your favorite? Which one do you prefer the most? Who do you want to see make it to the playoff? Who do you want to see in the national championship game? I'm not willing to say I think Michigan can beat Georgia. I'm not positive that Georgia can beat Alabama. But right now, that is what I'm thinking. I think that's what the majority of people believe it will be, is a Michigan-Georgia national championship. But anything can happen, guys. Get ready for madness, because I'm sure it's going to happen. Again, thank you for watching. After this weekend, I am going to be doing a breakdown of the official playoff poll after the weekend. Going to talk about what I think is going to happen in those games, give my breakdown of those. Can't wait to watch these games this weekend. It's going to be a real great time. All of these games are great. As I said, thank you for watching, everybody. Have a good week and enjoy college football this weekend while we still have it.